Yeah, so we were thinking about like how to bring this back to this meetup. So I've talked to this meetup a few times. Dan has been gracious enough to invite me as well, and I came to Mark's meetup, or he was here, Mark Tarpening, where he talked about early days Tesla, which I thought was amazing. It was one of my favorite meetups ever. So I really appreciate Dan putting that on. And I was thinking through, wow, he's talking about a lot of early stage experiments that are really tied into what we're writing. And so I reached out to Dan and we started thinking through, okay, how do we communicate this? And so I've been like sharing this meetup video. I don't know how many YouTube views you have, but we've been keep sharing this story. And so if you think about early stage Tesla, right, they could have been like, oh, build it and they will come. But when we listened to him talk about this, I thought it was amazing to hear about some of the early stage scrappy testing that I didn't even know Tesla did. And so this is Mark. He was gracious enough. We showed the YouTube link. We'll have to share that out as well, Dan, because it was it was one of my favorite meetups ever. But if you look about what they did early days testing and you go watch that video, which I highly recommend you do, you'll listen to him talk about doing some like early stage boomerang testing, which is like competitive user testing. So we didn't have a lot of licensed EVs in the state of California. Now, today you would say, oh, they're everywhere. But back then, we didn't have a lot of licensed EVs. And so he was going around looking at this one. I think the nickname for this one is like Cheese Louise because it looks like a cheese wedge. But this idea of like they looked like punishment cars. They were like really like these small, really not like luxury sports cars. And so he didn't just jump off building. He did a lot of competitive user testing. And then you think about next, what they did was kind of a mashup. So they took a Lotus Elise body and they took other components and they kind of mashed it up into an MVP. With my software clients that I coach, they're using like Zaps and Notion tables and landing pages and they're wiring stuff together. But in hardware, I think this is becoming more common with my hardware companies as well. But we're kind of mashing stuff up to make something that there's a value exchange. Like people can drive this around, they can give feedback on it. So this idea of a mashup, or sometimes they call them Frankensteins, this idea of let's test this, but let's not build it from scratch, try to reinvent everything. Let's try to use existing tech and kind of mash it up together. So there's a video of him explaining this, and I want to go ahead and play that for you all as well.
And by November, we were putting our battery pack, our drivetrain basically, into a Lotus Elise shell and our chassis. And this was to sort of test out, it was called a mule. You take parts from one car and parts from another. It isn't what's going to reproduce, but it was a test bed so that we could test it out. What we learned was that the Lotus Elise, the sort of chassis that we were using, was like a $35,000 sports car. And we knew that our price was going to be more like $100,000. So things that were acceptable in a $35,000 sports car really weren't okay for our market. So we had everyone that we knew, we'd drive up with what looked like a Lotus Elise, and we'd have people get in and out of it and try to turn it on and try to understand what the instrument cluster said and try to get any heat out of the thing or cool or whatever. And we learned a ton.
Yeah, so if you start looking at all this stuff, let's just pause on this a moment. Look at all the stuff, and there was a laundry list of stuff he talked about, but this idea of, well, we learned the doors weren't good enough. I remember he's talked about women had a hard time kind of opening doors and getting in and out of the car. The air conditioning, right? It's not an ICE engine, right? It's electric, and how do we generate enough heat? So it was really amazing to hear firsthand. It's one of the reasons I really love this meetup, to hear about early stage testing of how messy it was. It wasn't like they had a perfect vision of Tesla and just willed it into being. There was a lot of messiness and discipline with regards to testing. So they also tested with landing pages. So that's another way you can test. I think out of the lean startup movement, maybe we over-popularized landing pages a bit because I think people jump to landing pages too soon sometimes. But this idea of a landing page, and can we test some of the value propositions, have a call to action? And so if you start looking at Wayback Machine here, again, this is a long time ago, but if you start looking at, you can see the call to action. It's literally just like put in your email, we'll start reaching out to you. And then you think forward, it's like, okay, then can we move to a point where we can do pre-sales? Now, I don't know how you sell 100 Tesla pre-orders at 100K a piece. That's not going to be a talk that I can give. But this idea of we're building directional evidence to say this is worth investing in, and we're trying to close that say-do gap. And by doing so, people pre-ordering, that's one way to close that gap. So when you think about testing, right, I love anytime you can get, you're in such an amazing location here in the Valley. Anytime you can get a successful entrepreneur to talk about the messiness of early days and how them talk about the process of how they went and tried to de-risk that, I think definitely take advantage of that. So yeah, just wanted to share that story. So thanks for inviting me up, Alex. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.